Professor HFY's elongated fingers tapped against the polished obsidian podium, the rhythmic sound echoing through the domed lecture hall. Rows of students, gathered from across the known galaxy, sat in expectant silence. Their various forms, some insectoid, others reptilian, a few even gelatinous, shifted subtly in their seats, their eyes, lenses, or sensory tendrils trained on the towering figure before them. The Galactic Institute of Survival Sciences prided itself on pushing the limits of its students, but today's announcement would do more than test their endurance. It would separate those who merely understood survival from those who could master it. Professor HFY's deep, resonant voice carried across the hall. The final examination will determine whether you leave this institution as competent survivors or as failures unworthy of further instruction. He let the words settle, watching as the tension thickened. Each of you will be transported to an uninhabitable planet, designated X-92, where you must construct a shelter using only the natural resources available. You'll have 48 hours. Success is not measured by comfort, but by endurance. Your shelter must withstand the elements. Should you fail, well, we will retrieve whatever remains of you. A ripple of unease passed through the students. Some exchanged wary glances, while others straightened with the resolve of those who had faced worse. In the back row, James Carter sat motionless, hands clasped together as he listened. He had learned, in his short time at the Institute, that speaking before necessity was a waste of breath. His presence among the aliens had been met with skepticism, sometimes outright condescension. Humans were still an anomaly in the greater galactic society, an emerging species from a single world, barely out of their solar system, yet arrogant enough to believe they could stand among the best. Are there limitations on tool fabrication? Asked a towering, armor-plated student whose race, the Gorvax, were famed for their natural exoskeletal durability. Professor HFY's slit-pupiled eyes regarded the speaker with something close to amusement. Your mind and your hands are your only tools. You may shape what the planet provides, but no pre-constructed technology may be used. Another student, a sinuous being with iridescent scales, flicked their forked tongue. What are the conditions of X-92? Extreme, the professor replied simply. James finally spoke. Define extreme. Silence fell. Few ever addressed HFY so directly. The professor turned his head, studying James for a moment before answering. X-92 is volatile. Temperatures fluctuate from below freezing to near boiling within hours. The atmosphere is breathable but filled with particulate storms capable of flaying exposed flesh. Seismic instability is common. The ecosystem is sparse, hostile, and largely uncharted. He let a brief pause stretch before adding, adaptation is key. I suggest you begin considering how you will survive. James nodded. He had spent his life listening to people describe impossible conditions. Earth, for all its beauty, was a crucible. Humans had endured deserts that could cook flesh, tundras that could freeze bone, hurricanes, earthquakes, droughts. They didn't just survive in hospitable environments. They adapted, overcame, and built civilizations in places where no life should have thrived. Professor HFY activated a control on his wristband, and the hall's floor shimmered as dozens of holographic displays flickered to life. Coordinates and biometric data scrolled across them, assigning each student a designated drop zone. James glanced at his, memorizing the digits before the display vanished. There will be no assistance, the professor continued. No rescues until the test concludes. You succeed or you fail. There is no middle ground. One by one, students were called forward. As their names were spoken, each was teleported in a flash of light, vanishing from the safety of the Institute and into the unknown. James was among the last. When his turn came, he rose without hesitation. The moment the teleportation sequence completed, everything changed. Gone was the sterile, temperature-controlled air of the Institute. Instead, James was met with a wall of scorching wind that carried fine, stinging dust, biting at his exposed skin. His boots crunched against cracked, uneven terrain as he steadied himself, instinctively scanning his surroundings. The sky above churned with deep violet storm clouds, flickering with unnatural, green-tinged lightning. Jagged rock formations jutted from the ground, like the broken ribs of some long-dead beast. In the distance, mountains loomed, their peaks lost in the haze of dust and shifting light. James crouched, running his fingers through the dry, fractured soil. It was loose, unstable, likely no good for structural support. He turned in a slow circle, taking stock. No immediate signs of water. Sparse vegetation, low to the ground, suggesting high winds were a constant factor. He exhaled, his breath barely audible over the howling wind. Extreme, indeed. His mind moved swiftly, piecing together priorities. Shelter first. Exposure would kill him faster than thirst or hunger. The landscape offered little in the way of natural protection, which meant he'd have to construct something quickly. His eyes traced the nearest rock formations, possible windbreaks, if nothing else. A tremor rumbled beneath his feet. Not strong, but enough to tell him that earthquakes weren't just a theoretical concern. Stability would be an issue. James adjusted the strap of his pack, mostly empty save for a basic survival knife and a few meters of woven fiber, the only allowances given by the Institute. Not much, but he had built with less. He had survived worse. Another gust of wind slammed into him, forcing him to brace against a rock. Time was already against him. With practiced efficiency, he moved, searching for the right materials. He wasn't thinking about the 48-hour deadline. He wasn't thinking about impressing the professor or proving humanity's worth to his skeptical peers. He was thinking about the next hour, then the next. Survive first, build second, and if he had time left over, he'd show them what a human could really do. James worked fast. The wind was relentless, carrying a fine grit that scoured exposed skin and forced him to squint against the stinging assault. The temperature had already dropped, and if the professor's warning was accurate, it would continue plummeting until the land froze solid before rising again in a cycle meant to break anything foolish enough to remain unprepared. He could feel the pressure shift in the air, a sign of an approaching storm. Time was running out. He moved toward the nearest rock formation, a jagged ridge of dark, weathered stone jutting from the cracked earth. It wasn't much, but it provided a windbreak, his first advantage. He ran a hand along the surface, testing for stability. The rock was solid, but the ground beneath it was fractured, unstable. He needed to build high enough to avoid the worst of the shifting terrain, but low enough to withstand the wind. James crouched and pressed his palm against the dirt, feeling its texture. Dry, loose, but layered. Beneath the brittle topsoil, there was compacted sediment, stronger than it looked. He could use it. The problem was time. He had none. A guttural curse echoed in the distance, carried by the wind. He turned, scanning the horizon. A figure stumbled across the uneven terrain, their elongated limbs struggling against the shifting ground. The Gorvac student, the one who had questioned the rules back at the Institute. His kind was built for combat, not adaptability. James could already tell what had happened. He had tried to brute force a shelter and failed. James kept watching. The Gorvax was dragging something, a collapsed structure of interwoven branches and stone, its weight slowing him down. It hadn't been designed for the wind, and now he was paying for it. Another gust struck, and the alien lost his grip, his half-formed shelter torn apart and scattered like dead leaves. The Gorvax let out a frustrated snarl. James turned back to his own work. He didn't have time to worry about the others. Not yet. He set to work, gathering what materials he could find. The plant life on this planet was sparse, low to the ground with thick, fibrous stalks. He tested their flexibility, tough, resistant to tearing, good for binding. He began weaving them together, forming makeshift ropes. They wouldn't hold forever, but they didn't need to. They just had to last through the night. Using the rock formation as an anchor, he reinforced a small alcove, stacking stones in a way that let the wind pass through rather than resist it. Fighting the storm was useless. He had to redirect it, let it move around him instead of against him. He tied the woven fiber across the entrance, creating a barrier that would slow the wind but still allow airflow. The last thing he needed was to suffocate in his own shelter. By the time the storm hit, he was ready. The sky darkened, swirling with violent streaks of green lightning. The wind howled, rattling his crude structure, but it held. He sat inside, knees drawn up, listening to the chaos outside. He didn't sleep. Not yet. He could hear the wind ripping apart anything that wasn't built to last. Somewhere in the distance, another shelter collapsed, followed by an angry, alien-sounding curse. He wasn't the only one struggling, but he might be one of the few still standing by mourning. The night stretched long, but eventually the wind died. The temperature began to rise again, and James knew he had to move before the next cycle started. He stepped outside, stretching his stiff limbs. The landscape was littered with the remains of failed shelters, bits of debris scattered across the cracked ground. Some students were still moving, rebuilding, adjusting. Others weren't. James rolled his shoulders, considering his next move. His shelter had worked, but it wouldn't last another storm. He needed something better, and fast. Movement caught his eye. The Gorvax, battered and furious, was dragging himself toward the remains of his shelter, picking through the wreckage. James exhaled sharply. He didn't owe anyone help, but he knew the truth. Alone, the other students would fail. And if enough of them failed, the test would turn into something else entirely. James walked toward the Gorvax, stopping a few feet away. The alien looked up, baring sharp teeth. "What do you want, human?" James gestured at the ruins of his shelter. It worked. The Gorvax narrowed his eyes. "For now." "Long enough," James corrected. He glanced at the destroyed structure at the alien's feet. "Yours didn't." The Gorvax let out a low growl but didn't argue. James kicked at a fallen branch, testing its weight. "You built against the wind. You need to build with it." He picked up a stone, balancing it on his palm. "Stacked wrong, this gets knocked over. But lean it the right way, and the wind keeps it in place." He set the stone down, letting it rest at an angle. The Gorvax watched silent. James met his gaze. "You want to survive, or you want to be stubborn?" The alien grunted but finally nodded. James exhaled, glancing at the sky. They didn't have much time before the next storm. "Then let's build something that lasts." James worked quickly, knowing hesitation was as dangerous as the storm itself. The Gorvax, despite his earlier frustration, followed his lead, watching intently as James demonstrated how to use the wind rather than fight it. Together, they reinforced the structure, layering stones at an angle, weaving plant fibers into stronger bindings. The Gorvax had raw strength, and James had precision. Between them, the shelter transformed from a crude alcove into something that could endure. As they worked, other students emerged from the wreckage of their failures. Some stared in shock at what remained of their efforts. Others sat motionless, exhausted, defeated. They had all underestimated X-92. They had assumed intelligence and superior physiology would carry them through. Now, with the next storm already gathering on the horizon, they were beginning to realize that neither strength nor knowledge alone would be enough. A reptilian student, her scaled skin marred with deep cuts from flying debris, limped toward James. She regarded him with wary respect. "Your shelter held?" He nodded. She hesitated, then cast a glance at her ruined attempt. "Mine didn't." James studied her. She was proud. Most of them were, but survival had a way of stripping away arrogance. He nodded toward the structure. "Help us build something better." She eyed the Gorvax, who gave a slow, begrudging nod. After a pause, she knelt beside them and started working. Word spread fast. One by one, other students approached, hesitant but desperate. James didn't turn anyone away. They needed numbers. The next storm would be worse. He could feel it in the shifting air, in the way the dust swirled low to the ground, restless. If they didn't fortify now, there wouldn't be another chance. He assigned tasks based on strengths. The Gorvaks handled heavy lifting, moving stones into place. The reptilian student, with her sharp claws, wove plant fibers into stronger bindings. Others gathered what materials they could find, scavenging from their failed shelters and repurposing them into something that would last. The plan was simple. Rather than scattered, isolated shelters, they would build a single fortified structure, a wind-resistant dome nestled against the rock formation. Interlocking walls for stability, a shared fire pit for warmth, layered insulation against the temperature shifts. They had no blueprints, no technology to guide them, only instinct, logic, and the drive to survive. It was slow at first, each student uncertain, unwilling to fully trust. But as the structure took shape, something changed. The panic faded. The hesitation lessened. They moved faster, more efficiently. For the first time since arriving, they were working together, not just as individuals struggling to endure, but as something more. James barely noticed when the sky darkened again, the wind picking up, warning of what was coming. The work didn't stop. They built until their hands were raw, until their muscles ached, until the storm was nearly upon them. Then, as the first howling gust tore across the landscape, they retreated inside. The wind screamed, battering the walls, but the structure held. The fire flickered, but did not die. They sat in the dim glow of the flames, breathless, listening to the chaos outside. And for the first time, no one was alone. James exhaled, leaning back against the stone wall. He could feel exhaustion creeping in, but he forced himself to stay alert. Around him, the others sat in silence, each of them realizing what had happened. They had built a village in a day. Not just a shelter, something bigger, something sustainable. Someone chuckled, low and disbelieving. The Gorvak smirked. Not bad, human. James let out a tired breath. Not bad at all. The storm had raged for hours, but the village held. The reinforced dome shuddered under the wind's assault, yet the stones remained in place. The woven fibers held firm, and the fire continued to burn. For the first time since arriving on X-92, the students had a true refuge. James sat near the entrance, listening as the howling winds finally began to die. Around him, the others stirred, their exhaustion replaced by something unfamiliar, relief. They had survived not through strength alone, nor through intelligence and isolation, but by working together. When the first rays of the strange violet sunrise cut through the dust-filled sky, James stood and pushed open the reinforced entryway. Outside, the landscape was battered, the remains of failed shelters scattered across the cracked earth. The storm had wiped away nearly everything. Nearly. Their village remained. The others stepped out behind him, their gazes sweeping over the desolate horizon, then back to what they had built. There was no cheering, no celebration, only quiet, stunned recognition of what they had accomplished. And then, in a pulse of blue light, Professor HFY arrived. He stood at the edge of the village, his tall, sinewy frame motionless, his black eyes scanning the structure before him. The storm had left him untouched, his long academic robes immaculate, as if he had merely stepped from the lecture hall into another world without concern for the conditions. James met his gaze, standing firm. He knew this moment had arrived not just for him, but for all of them. The professor's gaze swept the gathered students. Some straightened under his scrutiny. Others shifted uneasily, unsure what verdict awaited. This was not the task I assigned, HFY said at last. Murmurs rippled through the group. James clenched his jaw. We were told to survive, he said. We did. HFY's piercing stare landed on him. You were told to build a shelter. James gestured to the village. We built something better. Silence stretched. The professor's expression was unreadable, but James held his ground. He knew how the Galactic Institute worked. This wasn't about following orders. It was about proving capability. and nothing they had done had been against the rules. XY stepped forward, running his fingers along the stone wall, inspecting the weaving of the plant fibers, the placement of each support. Finally, he turned back to them. "You have redefined the parameters of survival," he said. A weight lifted from the group. Some exchanged glances. Others simply exhaled, releasing tension they hadn't realized they were holding. XY clasped his hands behind his back. A single shelter is protection. A village is sustainability. Most species take generations to understand this distinction. You grasped it in a day. His gaze lingered on James. And I suspect I know why. James didn't look away. Humans don't just survive. We build. A rare flicker of amusement crossed the professor's otherwise unreadable face. "Indeed," he said. Lesson complete. With a flick of his wrist, the familiar pull of teleportation surrounded them. The barren landscape of X-92 vanished, replaced by the polished floors and high ceilings of the lecture hall. The air was clean again, free of dust and heat. It felt strange, almost artificial after what they had endured. The students stood in silence, still processing. Some glanced at each other, uncertain. Others simply stared ahead, lost in thought. XY turned to the class. "Congratulations. You have passed." The relief was palpable. A few students sighed, some straightened with pride. The Gorvax let out a low, satisfied grunt. James remained quiet. He wasn't thinking about passing. He was thinking about what they had proven, not just to the professor, but to themselves. The universe had underestimated them. It wouldn't make that mistake again.